rhythm context, according to Gordon. Skills, context, content. Skills, what are students doing? Context, which is what we're going to focus on in this video, is tonality or meter. In the previous video, we talked about tonal context, aka the tonality, and in this video, we'll talk about rhythmic context, aka meter. Content is functions and patterns within those contexts. Now, Gordon's definition of rhythm differs from a lot of other people's because it's obviously based upon audiation rather than notation. So according to Gordon's theory, rhythm exists on three fundamental levels: macrobeats, microbeats, and the melodic rhythm. Let's roll the clip.
Rhythm exists on three fundamental levels: macrobeats, microbeats, and rhythm patterns. These levels interact with each other in musical space to form the foundation of music. The first level is the macrobeat. This is what you might call the pulse of the music. It's what you would likely tap your foot to, or the beat you would move to if you were dancing. The macrobeat defines the tempo of the music. We can take that macrobeat and divide it into either 2 or 3 parts. These parts are called microbeats. These are the little beats in music. The microbeat defines the meter of the music. If we take that macrobeat and divide it into 2 microbeats, we are in duple meter. If we divide each macrobeat into 3 microbeats, we are in triple meter. There are, of course, many other meters, but rhythm is really just 2s and 3s and any combination you wish to imagine. Macrobeats and microbeats form the foundation for rhythm and should be constantly swirling around in your audiation as you make music. On top of those 2 layers is the melodic rhythm of the song. The melodic rhythm is comprised of combinations of rhythm patterns or rhythmic words. Rhythm and movement go hand in hand. Rhythm requires coordination. In order to have a true sense of rhythm, one must be able to move their body to macrobeats and microbeats and the space in between. The amount of space between the macrobeats will determine how fast or slow the tempo is. Moving not to the beat is just as important as moving to the beat. Try some of these movements. As you are listening to these macrobeats and microbeats, move as much of your body as you feel comfortable moving in free-flowing continuous space. Imagine that you are in the deep end of a pool and that you are wading your arms through the water. This is very important in order to feel the space in between the beats. While moving in continuous flow in space, try adding flicks or pulses on the microbeat. Pat your fingers on your lap to the microbeat with spider fingers. Gently shift your weight from side to side on the macrobeat.
Now, it bears repeating that Gordon's ideas about meter are different than traditional music theorists' definition of meter because they're based upon audiation rather than notation. So now, Gordon has 2 broad categories of meter. He has what he calls usual meter and unusual meter. But a lot of us nowadays, instead of thinking about them as usual or unusual, because really, who's to say based upon your culture whether something is usual or unusual, we tend to think about them as even meters versus uneven meters. Let's begin with even meters, or what Gordon called usual meters. In usual meter, the macrobeats, or the pulse of the music, are of equal length and they are paired. So in usual meter, the meter is determined by the number of microbeats for each macrobeat. So if we've got a 2-to-1 relationship, ba, 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 that's usual duple or even duple. If we've got 3, regardless of the tempo, that would be usual triple or even, triple. Most of us just call it duple and triple. Now, Ed also identifies another meter called usual combined, where you have combinations of 2s and 3s, but the macrobeat remains consistent, something like ba 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 ba. But I really am dubious about whether that is actually a meter at all, or rather that's just duple with triplets. Ba 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 ba, or triple with duplets. Ba 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 ba. But I'll leave that up to you to figure out. So that's even meters. So now we come to uneven meters, or what Ed would call unusual meters. So an unusual meter or uneven meter, the macrobeats are of unequal length, and they're either paired or unpaired. So an uneven meter, the meter is identified by the grouping of the macrobeats. And there's two primary meters that fall into this category: uneven paired and uneven unpaired. In uneven paired meter, the macrobeats are paired and they are of unequal length. So I'm thinking about time signatures like 5-4 or 5-8. You have two macrobeats, and they're of unequal length and they're paired. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Mac, 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 Mac. The microbeats being ba, 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 ba. So that's 2 and 3. We could do 3 and 2. Ba, 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 ba. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And then we have uneven unpaired meter. In this meter, the macrobeats are unpaired and they're of unequal length. Usually time signatures that have a 7 or an 8 on top fall into this category. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. The macrobeats being ba, 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 ba. Unpaired, unequal length.
To get teaching ideas and notation for this tune and many others, check out my book, 50 Tunes for Teaching.
Or 8-8. Ba, 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 ba. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Now, Gordon also has some meters that he calls unusual paired intact and unusual unpaired intact, but we're going to leave that for another video, if at all. Because I'm not really sure if they're indeed meters or if they just happen to be additional rhythmic functions or accents. Now, just as we did tonally, we're going to need to label the sounds that are inside a student's audiation. And the best syllable system, from my perspective, and I am rather opinionated about this, is the movable do rhythm syllable system. Macrobeats, regardless of their meter, are going to get the syllable do. Do, 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 do. Or in triple. Do, 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 do. Uneven paired. Do, 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 do. Uneven unpaired. Do, 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 do. Now the next layer of beat is the microbeat, and the microbeats are going to get different syllables based upon their meter. In duple meter, macrobeats are do, 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 and microbeats are do, day, do, day, do, day, do, day. Now let me say a word about enrhythmic time signatures. Someone is going to ask, well, what about the difference between 2/4 and 4/4 and cut time? And the answer is, there is no difference. It doesn't matter if we're in 2/4 or 4/4 or cut time or any other duple time signature, we're going to use the same syllables. Do, 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 day, do. Do, day, do, day, do, day, do. 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 In triple meter, regardless of whether we are in 6/8 or 3/4 or 6/4 or 3/8, the microbeats are going to get the syllables do-da-dee, 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 do-da-dee. If we're in a fast 6/8 time, do-do-da-dee, do-da-dee, do, do-da-dee, 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 do. If we're in a slower 3/4, do-da-dee, 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 do-da-dee. Mr. Mullen, my music theory teacher told me that 6/8 is actually compound duple and not treble. Yes. Again, there's always two systems at play, the audiation system and the notation system. Your music theory teacher is absolutely correct that according to notation, 6/8 is compound duple. But from an audiation perspective, which we must teach first, 6/8 is a triple time signature because we are audiating do, do, do as the macro beats and do-da-dee as the microbeats. Now in uneven meters, the macrobeat, as I previously stated, remains do, 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 do. And we will change the days in the dotties to bays and bobbies. Do, bay, do, bobby, do, bay, do, bobby, do, bobby, do, bay, do, bobby, do, bay. Or do, bay, do, bay, do, bobby, do, bay, do, bay, do, bobby. In the next video, we'll talk about rhythm content. And what is content? Functions and patterns. So I'm not going to spoil this for you, but we have a whole bunch of rhythmic functions. We have divisions, we have elongations, division elongations, ties, rests, and upbeats. But because we're talking about rhythm syllables, I'll talk briefly about the next level of beat, which is the division. So when you take a microbeat and divide it again, you get a division, regardless of the meter. And we will use the syllable ta for division. So do, day, do, ta, data, do, ta, data, do, ta, data, do, ta, data. Or triple. Do, microbeat, do-da-dee, do-da-dee, do-da-dee divisions, do-ta-data-dita, 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 do-ta-data-dita. Uneven paired. Do-ba-be, do-bay, do-ba-be, do-bay, do-ta-bata-beta, do-ta-beta, do-ta-bata-beta, do-ta-beta. Uneven, unpaired. Do-ba-be, do-bay, do-bay, do-ba-be, do-bay, do-bay, do-ta-bata-beta, do-ta-beta, do-ta-beta, do-ta-bata-beta, do-ta-beta, do-ta-beta.
Are you a piano teacher? You may be interested in my audiation-based reading program, Piano Patterns for your studio. Scan the QR code or click below to find out how to teach reading in a fun and natural way with Piano Patterns.
Beverly, end video.